I let my daughter-in-law take my house, and she smiled like she had already won. In the weeks after the papers were signed, the house on Maple Ridge Drive did not change all at once. Instead, the changes arrived slowly, almost politely, the way autumn arrives in a quiet neighborhood. Margaret Whitmore noticed the first shift on a Tuesday morning while she was pouring coffee into her favorite ceramic mug, the one with a small painted lighthouse on the side. Ashley walked into the kitchen holding a clipboard and a bright, cheerful smile that looked perfectly normal at first glance. She began talking about plans for the house, mentioning how the living room might look better with lighter paint and how the front porch could use modern furniture instead of the wooden rocking chairs Margaret and Thomas had used for decades. Margaret listened politely, assuming these were only suggestions, the kind of casual ideas families often shared. But Ashley spoke differently now. Her tone sounded less like a question and more like a decision that had already been made. Over the following days the conversations continued. Ashley ordered new curtains for the dining room without asking. She began reorganizing cabinets in the kitchen, moving Margaret's dishes and cookware into different shelves, as if she had memorized a new layout for the house. Margaret told herself that younger people often like to rearrange things, and she did not want to seem difficult or ungrateful. After all, Ashley had insisted she was only trying to help make life easier. Daniel rarely commented on any of it. He usually sat quietly at the dinner table, nodding whenever Ashley explained her newest idea for improving the house. One evening, Ashley casually mentioned that the guest room upstairs might be better used as a home office because Daniel sometimes worked remotely. Margaret agreed without hesitation, even though that room had once been Daniel's childhood bedroom and still held a few dusty boxes of old photographs and school trophies. A few days later, Ashley replaced the guest room sign on the door with a small plaque that read office. The change was subtle, but Margaret felt something shift inside her chest when she walked past it. The home she had built with Thomas suddenly felt slightly unfamiliar, like a place that had begun belonging to someone else without announcing the change out loud. The moment that truly unsettled her happened during a Sunday dinner when Ashley began discussing a long list of renovations she wanted to start before winter arrived. She spoke about repainting the living room, replacing the porch railing, and possibly converting the downstairs study into a nursery someday in the future. Margaret had always believed that Daniel and Ashley were simply sharing the house with her, but Ashley spoke as though every room already belonged to their plans. Margaret forced a gentle smile and told herself she was imagining things. She reminded herself that families evolve and houses change with time. Yet late that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Margaret stood alone in the quiet kitchen and looked around at the familiar cabinets, the worn wooden floor, and the old clock above the stove that Thomas had hung there nearly 30 years earlier. For the first time since signing the documents, she wondered if the home she had trusted her family with might no longer feel like her own. During the following month, the atmosphere inside the house continued to change in quiet but undeniable ways. Margaret Whitmore noticed that Ashley no longer spoke about the home as something the family shared. Instead, she began referring to it with a tone that sounded like ownership. One afternoon, while Margaret was watering the flowers near the porch, she overheard Ashley speaking on the phone with a friend in the living room. Ashley was describing the property in a confident voice, mentioning the size of the lot, the two-car garage, and the large maple tree in the front yard, as if she were proudly presenting something she had acquired. Margaret stood still for a moment, listening through the open window, and felt an uneasy weight settle in her chest. She reminded herself again that families often speak casually and that she should not read too much into a simple conversation. But the small signals kept appearing. Ashley began organizing the garage and decided that several old boxes belonging to Margaret should be moved into the basement storage area. She explained that the garage needed more space for Daniel's truck and her own sport utility vehicle. Margaret agreed politely, although those boxes contained tools and decorations she and Thomas had used for decades. Later that week, Ashley ordered new furniture for the living room without discussing it first. When the delivery truck arrived, two men carried in a large gray sectional sofa and removed the old floral couch Margaret had bought with Thomas many years earlier. Ashley thanked the delivery crew and instructed them to take the old couch away for disposal. Margaret watched quietly from the hallway as the couch was carried through the front door, remembering countless evenings when she and Thomas had sat there together watching television after dinner. Daniel continued to stay mostly silent through these changes. Whenever Margaret asked him whether the renovations were necessary, he simply said Ashley was trying to modernize the house and increase its value. His tone sounded practical rather than emotional, as if the house had already become an investment instead of a family memory. The moment that troubled Margaret the most happened on a cool Saturday evening when Ashley invited several neighbors over for coffee and dessert. Margaret greeted everyone politely and offered to help serve drinks, but Ashley gently told her that she could relax in the den because Ashley wanted to show the guests around the house. From the hallway, Margaret listened as Ashley walked the visitors through each room, proudly describing the improvements she planned to make in the coming months. She spoke about future renovations, new flooring, and possibly expanding the kitchen. At one point, Margaret heard Ashley say something that made her pause completely. Ashley laughed lightly and told the guests that the house had recently been transferred into Daniel's name, so they were excited to start making it truly their own. The words echoed quietly in Margaret's mind long after the neighbors left that night. For the first time since signing the documents downtown, she began to realize that Ashley did not see Margaret as the woman who built the house. Ashley saw her as someone who simply lived there for now, someone whose place inside the home might not be permanent. Over the next several weeks, Margaret Whitmore tried to convince herself that the changes in the house were simply part of a younger couple settling into their future, yet each passing day seemed to push her a little further away from the life she once recognized. The small blue house on Maple Ridge Drive still looked the same from the outside, with its white shutters and the tall maple trees stretching over the driveway, but inside it felt increasingly unfamiliar. Ashley had begun replacing small things without discussion, changing light fixtures in the hallway, bringing in new rugs for the living room, and rearranging the framed photographs that Margaret and Thomas had carefully hung over the years. One afternoon, Margaret noticed that the large wedding portrait of her and Thomas, which had always hung above the fireplace, was no longer there. In its place, Ashley had positioned a modern canvas print of a quiet mountain landscape. When Margaret asked gently where the photograph had gone, Ashley smiled and explained that she had moved it to the upstairs hallway because the living room needed a more updated look. Margaret nodded politely, even though the explanation did not ease the quiet ache in her chest. The house that once held decades of memories now seemed to be slowly erasing them piece by piece. Daniel remained distant during these moments. Whenever Margaret mentioned the changes, he would reassure her that Ashley was simply trying to improve the home and make it comfortable for everyone. His words sounded reasonable, yet his voice lacked the warmth she remembered from years earlier. One evening, during dinner, Ashley began speaking excitedly about future plans for the house. She mentioned that several friends of hers had recently started families, and she believed the neighborhood would be perfect for raising children. She talked about how the backyard could easily fit a playset and how the downstairs study could eventually become a nursery if the time came. Margaret listened quietly while stirring the soup in her bowl, trying to follow the conversation without interrupting. Then Ashley casually mentioned something that caused the room to feel suddenly colder. She explained that Margaret's bedroom was the largest room on the first floor, and that someday it might be the ideal space for a nursery because it was close to the kitchen and the backyard door. Ashley said it with the same cheerful tone she used for every renovation idea, as if she were discussing furniture placement rather than someone's living space. Margaret looked up slowly from the table and realized what Ashley was implying. In Ashley's plans for the future of the house, Margaret was no longer part of the arrangement. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, but said nothing. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds before Ashley continued describing paint colors and furniture ideas, yet Margaret felt something inside her settle with quiet certainty. For the first time, she understood that Ashley believed the house already belonged entirely to her and Daniel, and that Margaret's place within its walls was slowly being reduced to something temporary. The conversation at the dinner table lingered in Margaret Whitmore's mind long after the dishes had been washed and the kitchen lights were turned off for the night. Ashley's casual remark about converting the bedroom into a nursery had sounded cheerful on the surface, but the meaning behind it was impossible to ignore. Margaret spent that evening sitting quietly in the den, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the same armchair where she and Thomas used to drink tea together before bed. For years, the house had always felt steady and predictable, but now every room seemed to carry a quiet tension she had never noticed before. Over the next several days, Ashley's plans for the house continued as if nothing unusual had been said. She spoke often about renovations, about reorganizing storage spaces, and about preparing the home for what she called the next stage of life. One morning, she mentioned that the basement could easily be turned into a comfortable guest suite with a small bedroom and a sitting area. Ashley explained that many families redesign basements that way so older relatives could have a quiet place of their own. Margaret listened carefully while standing at the kitchen counter, drying a set of plates that had belonged to her mother many years earlier. Ashley spoke with a tone that sounded thoughtful and practical, describing how peaceful the basement would be because it stayed cool in the summer and quiet throughout the day. The explanation sounded polite, but Margaret understood the message hidden beneath the words. Ashley was slowly preparing a future where Margaret no longer occupied the main floor of the home she had built with Thomas. Daniel once again said very little during these conversations. When Margaret asked him later that evening whether the basement renovation was truly necessary, he simply said Ashley was thinking ahead and trying to make the house work better for everyone. His voice carried the calm logic of someone who believed the situation was reasonable. Margaret did not argue with him. Instead, she nodded and thanked him for explaining, even though the answer left her feeling strangely alone. A few days later, Ashley suggested hosting a small family meeting the following weekend. She said it would be a good opportunity to discuss the upcoming renovation plans and living arrangements so everyone could feel comfortable moving forward. Margaret agreed quietly, although she sensed the meeting would not be as simple as Ashley described. During the next week, Ashley spoke frequently about the gathering, mentioning that it would help the family make clear decisions about the future of the house. Margaret noticed how confident Ashley sounded whenever she talked about it, as though the outcome had already been decided. On the evening before the meeting, Margaret walked slowly through the house after everyone else had gone to bed. She paused in the living room where the old couch once stood, then continued past the kitchen window where she and Thomas used to watch summer storms roll across the sky. When she finally returned to her bedroom, she sat quietly on the edge of the bed, realizing that the upcoming meeting might determine whether the house she had built over 40 years would still truly belong to her. The morning of the family meeting arrived with a quiet stillness that seemed to settle over the entire neighborhood. Maple Ridge Drive looked exactly the way it always had on a calm Saturday morning. The tall maple tree in the front yard swayed gently in the breeze, and sunlight stretched across the driveway in long golden lines. Margaret Whitmore woke earlier than usual and walked slowly through the house, moving from room to room with a thoughtful calm. She paused in the kitchen to prepare a pot of coffee, the familiar smell filling the air just as it had for decades. For a moment, everything felt normal again, but Margaret knew the meeting Ashley had planned would change something important inside the house that day. Ashley came downstairs shortly after 9 o'clock, dressed neatly and already carrying a small folder filled with papers. Her energy was confident and organized, the way someone might prepare for an important presentation. She spoke cheerfully about how helpful the meeting would be for everyone, explaining that clear plans would make the future easier for the entire family. Daniel sat quietly at the kitchen table while Ashley talked, occasionally nodding but offering very few words of his own. Margaret listened politely, pouring coffee into 3 cups and setting them on the table. Ashley explained that she wanted to discuss the renovation timeline and the living arrangements once the basement project began. She described the basement again as a peaceful space that could easily be transformed into a comfortable private suite. Margaret noticed that Ashley always used the word suite instead of basement bedroom, as if the new name made the idea sound more generous. Around mid-morning, Ashley began arranging chairs in the living room so everyone could sit comfortably during the conversation. She placed her folder neatly on the coffee table and reviewed several pages inside it with quiet satisfaction. The documents appeared to contain renovation estimates and notes about construction schedules. Margaret watched calmly from the doorway, saying very little as Ashley prepared for the discussion. Just before the meeting was supposed to begin, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted the quiet routine inside the house. Ashley glanced toward the front window with mild curiosity because she had not expected anyone else to arrive. Margaret walked toward the door with steady steps and opened it before Ashley could ask any questions. Standing on the porch was a tall man in a dark blue suit, holding a leather briefcase in one hand. His expression was professional, but warm as he greeted Margaret politely. Margaret stepped aside and invited him into the house. Ashley appeared in the hallway a moment later and looked slightly confused as the visitor entered the living room. Margaret introduced him calmly as Richard Collins, a lawyer she had known for several years. Ashley blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting an attorney to be present at what she believed was simply a family planning conversation. Richard Collins placed his briefcase carefully beside the coffee table and greeted Daniel and Ashley with a courteous handshake. Margaret then took a seat in the same armchair she had used for years and folded her hands in her lap. The room grew noticeably quieter as Ashley glanced at the folder she had prepared and then back at the unexpected guest. For the first time that morning, the confident expression on Ashley's face showed a hint of uncertainty as the meeting officially began. The room remained quiet for several seconds after Richard Collins took his seat across from Ashley and Daniel. Sunlight from the living room window fell across the coffee table where Ashley's renovation papers were neatly stacked, but the confident energy she had shown earlier that morning was beginning to fade. Richard Collins rested his briefcase beside his chair and opened it with calm precision, removing a thin folder filled with neatly organized documents. His movements were slow and professional, the kind that suggested he had done this many times before. Ashley glanced toward Margaret with visible confusion before finally speaking. She asked politely why a lawyer had been invited to what she believed was simply a family conversation about renovations and living arrangements. Margaret answered gently that since the house and its future had become such an important topic, she felt it was wise to have someone present who fully understood the legal side of the paperwork that had been signed earlier in the year. Ashley's expression tightened slightly, though she tried to maintain her polite smile. Daniel shifted in his seat and looked toward the folder in the lawyer's hands with growing curiosity. Richard Collins cleared his throat softly and explained that Margaret had recently asked him to review the property documents connected to the house on Maple Ridge Drive. He spoke in a calm and measured tone that filled the quiet room without sounding confrontational. Ashley nodded quickly and said that everything should already be clear because the property had been transferred months earlier when Margaret agreed to place the house in Daniel's name. She even gestured toward her own folder as if to confirm that the family had already handled all necessary arrangements. Richard Collins acknowledged her statement with a polite nod before opening the folder he had brought with him. He carefully placed several pages on the coffee table so everyone could see them clearly. The documents contained copies of the original paperwork that had been signed during the meeting at the downtown office several months before. Ashley leaned forward slightly, appearing confident that the papers would confirm exactly what she believed. Richard Collins then began explaining that while the property had indeed been transferred under a legal structure involving Daniel's name, the arrangement was not as simple as it first appeared. Margaret had asked for a very specific legal clause to be included when the documents were prepared. The clause had been carefully written into the agreement to ensure that certain rights and conditions remained fully protected under the law. Ashley's smile slowly faded as she listened. She glanced quickly toward Daniel, who was now reading one of the pages with growing concentration. Richard Collins continued speaking calmly, explaining that the clause created a legal structure that would only allow full ownership of the property to change under particular circumstances that had not yet occurred. The explanation was precise and methodical, and each sentence seemed to replace Ashley's earlier confidence with a quiet uncertainty. Margaret remained seated in her armchair throughout the explanation, her hands folded gently in her lap. She watched the conversation unfold with the same calm expression she had carried all morning. For the first time since the meeting began, the conversation in the living room was no longer about renovation plans or basement suites. It had become something much more serious, something that Ashley had clearly not expected when she arranged the family meeting. The quiet tension in the living room grew heavier as Richard Collins continued speaking in his calm and steady voice. Ashley leaned forward in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced by visible confusion as she listened carefully to every word. Daniel held the document in his hands and read through several lines again, his brow slowly tightening as he realized there was more written into the agreement than he had originally understood. Richard Collins explained that when the property documents had been prepared months earlier, Margaret Whitmore had requested a legal structure known as a protected life estate clause. He spoke clearly so everyone in the room could understand the meaning of the words printed on the page. Under that clause, Margaret remained the permanent legal resident of the home for the remainder of her life, with full authority over how the property was used and managed. The document also stated that no renovation, sale, structural change, or reassignment of living space could be made without her direct written approval. Ashley blinked several times as she listened, clearly trying to process the explanation. She quickly glanced toward Daniel, as if hoping he might interrupt and clarify something, but Daniel continued reading silently. Richard Collins continued calmly, explaining that the clause had been included precisely to prevent misunderstandings about ownership and control of the house. While Daniel's name had been placed on the title structure as part of the long-term estate planning arrangement, Margaret had not surrendered the authority she held as the homeowner. In legal terms, she still controlled every major decision connected to the property. On Maple Ridge Drive, Ashley slowly leaned back in her chair as the meaning of the explanation settled in. Her renovation plans, the basement suite idea, and even the conversation about converting Margaret's bedroom into a nursery had all been based on the assumption that the house already belonged entirely to her and Daniel. Richard Collins gently placed another document on the coffee table and explained that the agreement also contained a second protective condition. If Margaret ever felt that the arrangement was being used in a way that made her uncomfortable or pressured her to give up space in the home, she had the legal right to cancel the transfer structure completely and return the full property title to her own name. The room fell completely silent for a moment after those words were spoken. Ashley looked down at the papers in front of her as if seeing them for the first time. Daniel slowly lowered the document he had been reading and looked across the room toward Margaret. Throughout the entire explanation, Margaret had remained seated quietly in the same armchair, her posture calm and composed. She had not raised her voice or interrupted anyone. She simply allowed the lawyer to explain the agreement exactly as it had been written months earlier. Ashley finally spoke again, her voice noticeably softer than before, asking whether the clause truly meant that all renovation decisions still required Margaret's approval. Richard Collins answered politely that the documents made that authority completely clear. Margaret Whitmore had never surrendered control of the home she had built with her husband decades earlier. The agreement had simply been structured to protect both her future and the house itself. As the weight of that reality settled into the quiet living room, the confident atmosphere Ashley had carried into the meeting that morning had completely disappeared. The silence in the living room lingered after Richard Collins finished explaining the final clause of the agreement. Ashley remained seated with her hands resting on the folder she had brought for the meeting, but the confident posture she carried earlier that morning had completely faded. Daniel looked from the document in his hands toward Margaret with a mixture of surprise and quiet reflection. The house around them felt suddenly still, as if the walls themselves were listening to the conversation that had just unfolded. Richard Collins carefully gathered the documents on the coffee table and placed them back into his folder, leaving one copy in front of Daniel and Ashley so they could read the terms again if they wished. Margaret Whitmore remained seated in her familiar armchair, her expression calm and steady. She had not raised her voice at any point during the meeting, and she had not interrupted the lawyer once while he explained the legal structure of the agreement. After a moment, she finally spoke, her tone gentle but clear. She explained that when she agreed to place Daniel's name into the estate planning structure months earlier, she had done it out of trust and love for her family. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had always been meant to stay within the family someday. However, she had also understood that circumstances could change and that misunderstandings sometimes grew quietly over time. That was why she had asked for the protective clause to be included before signing anything. Ashley looked down at the papers again as Margaret continued speaking. Margaret explained that the clause was never meant to embarrass anyone or create conflict. It was simply there to ensure that the home she and her husband built would remain a place where she could live peacefully without feeling pressured to give up the space that had been hers for more than 40 years. Daniel slowly nodded as the meaning of her words settled in. He admitted quietly that he had not paid close attention to every detail in the original paperwork and had trusted that everything had been handled properly at the time. Margaret gave him a small understanding smile and told him that trust was never the problem. What mattered now was making sure the family moved forward with respect and clarity. Ashley remained silent for several seconds before finally speaking in a much softer voice than before. She said she had believed the house had already become theirs to manage, and that she had simply been planning for the future. Margaret listened without anger and replied calmly that the future could still be discussed together, but decisions about the house would always begin with honesty and mutual respect. Richard Collins stood from his chair and prepared to leave, satisfied that the legal explanation had been understood by everyone present. Before stepping toward the door, he reminded them that the agreement was designed to protect the family, as well as the property itself. Margaret then rose from her armchair and walked slowly toward the front window where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the yard. The maple tree outside moved gently in the breeze just as it had for decades. In that quiet moment, it was clear to everyone in the room that the house on Maple Ridge Drive had never truly changed owners. It had simply reminded the people inside it who had built it and who still held the final word about its future.